Picture a hill outside Jerusalem, skies heavy, the crowd hushed. At the heart of that moment, Jesus speaks three simple words: "It is finished." Not just a final gasp in agony, but a declaration echoing through eternity. These words mark more than the end of suffering. They stand as the culmination of a divine mission, the prophecy fulfilled, the broken healed, and the debt of sin fully paid. The weight of centuries of promise and longing all hinge on that brief utterance. In the final hours leading up to these words, Jesus endured physical torment, emotional abandonment, spiritual darkness. Blood and sweat mingled with tears in the garden, betrayal by a friend, mockery by soldiers, the crushing weight of human sin pressing on his shoulders. Yet those three words were not spoken in despair, but with authority, an announcement that a purpose long set in motion had reached its appointed end. Those final moments on the cross held tension not only of agony, but of divine culmination. A plan older than creation approached its climax. Ancient scriptures whispered in the hearts of prophets came to fruition in that tragic yet triumphant moment. These words formed a bridge between suffering and redemption, death and resurrection, law and grace. This introduction sets the stage for exploring why Jesus said it is finished, what lay behind them, why he chose that precise phrasing in Greek tetelestai, meaning paid in full, and how those words transformed the human story. We'll dig into how that phrase pointed beyond the pain into the fulfillment of Scripture, the liberation of humanity, and the inauguration of a new covenant. As the darkness fell over Golgotha, casting a shadow even over the hardened hearts of Roman soldiers and fearful onlookers, Jesus, suspended between heaven and earth, summoned his remaining strength not to beg for mercy or curse his executioners, but to deliver a statement so powerful, so deeply rooted in divine intention, that it split history in two: "It is finished." Those three words, spoken not in resignation but in triumph, carried with them the entire weight of redemptive history, signaling not only the completion of one man's earthly journey, but the fulfillment of a cosmic plan set in motion long before Bethlehem or Sinai, long before Adam first drew breath in Eden's garden. In that moment, Jesus was not merely ending his suffering. He was announcing that the promises whispered through the ages, from the scrolls of Isaiah to the Psalms of David, had come to their appointed climax, and that what had been shadowed in types and symbols was now fulfilled in blood and reality. This cry was not a faint whisper of defeat, but a thunderous proclamation of completion, a sacred pronouncement that the old order was passing away and something entirely new was being born, where the covenant etched in stone would now be written on human hearts, where separation from God was no longer the sentence, but reconciliation the invitation. The skies grew dark, the earth quaked, the temple shook, not merely as signs of grief, but as acknowledgments from creation itself that something eternal had just been set right. The moment those words escaped the lips of Christ, the unseen realm stirred. Angels who had watched from the heavens since the fall of man now witnessed the bridge being rebuilt. The war for the soul of humanity, waged in shadows and prophecy, had reached its final battle, and the victor had spoken. "It is finished" never has so much been said with so few words. While the physical torment endured by Jesus on the cross was beyond human comprehension, what unfolded in those final moments went far deeper than torn flesh, punctured veins, or the crushing weight of a wooden beam upon bloodied shoulders. For what Jesus declared as finished was not simply his agony, but the total completion of a mission that began long before the carpenter's tools touched timber or the Galilean winds carried his voice. Jesus had come with a purpose intricately woven into the very fabric of time, a divine calling that spanned across centuries, fulfilled in every step he took, every word he spoke, every act of mercy he extended, and every confrontation he dared to initiate against systems that distorted the image of God. From his earliest teachings, where he declared that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, to his final breath where he affirmed that the gates of that kingdom now stood open, Jesus moved with unwavering intentionality, executing a plan that could neither be derailed by opposition nor diluted by compromise. Each parable he spoke, each person he healed, each prayer he uttered was not a random moment of compassion or a display of spiritual power. It was a calculated part of a greater story, a divine narrative that found its crescendo in the shadow of the cross, where the servant became the sacrifice and the teacher became the lamb. His declaration, "It is finished," was not simply the conclusion of suffering, but the sealing of purpose, the divine confirmation that nothing had been left undone, that every prophecy had been fulfilled, every requirement met, every aspect of the Father's will obeyed to the end. What the crowd may have mistaken as a dying man's final breath was in fact the Son's final signature, written not in ink but in blood, signing off the mission for which he had stepped into time, and ensuring that from that moment forward, nothing more would be needed to reconcile humanity to its Creator. In the economic language of the ancient world, the term telestai carried a profound implication, one that echoed through marketplaces, courtrooms, and prisons for when a debt had been settled, when an obligation had been met in full. That single word, stamped on receipts and carved into records, declared that nothing more was owed, nothing more required, and that the burden had been fully lifted. When Jesus, crucified between thieves, declared telestai, he was not speaking metaphorically or offering poetic imagery. He was using a precise term, understood by those who lived under the weight of Roman taxation and temple dues, to communicate that the spiritual debt incurred by humanity, the guilt accumulated through generations of rebellion and disobedience, had now been paid in its entirety, not delayed, not restructured, but fully and forever settled. This debt was not financial, and its consequences were not limited to earthly life. It was the moral and spiritual obligation owed to divine justice, a chasm between holiness and humanity that could not be bridged by ritual or religious effort, and which no human effort could ever hope to cross. The sacrifices of bulls and goats had offered temporary reprieve, a symbolic covering for guilt, but they could never remove sin's stain. Jesus, in taking upon himself the full weight of that guilt, became both the sacrifice and the payment, absorbing into his own being the penalty that should have been ours. In declaring the debt paid, Jesus not only removed the accusation that stood against us, but dismantled the legal right of the enemy to condemn. For what had been written in the divine ledger as charges against the soul was now wiped clean, not by forgetting, but by fulfillment. The courtroom of eternity no longer echoed with judgment, but with freedom, and the blood-stained cross stood as the eternal receipt, visible to all who would believe that the price had been paid in full. As Jesus exhaled his final breath and declared that the work was complete, an event unfolded in the heart of Jerusalem that was as symbolic as it was supernatural. The veil of the temple, that thick curtain which had for centuries separated the sacred from the profane, the divine presence from human approach, was torn violently from top to bottom, not by human hands, but by a divine act signifying that the barrier between God and man had been forever removed. This veil, woven with precision, representing generations of restricted access to the Holy of Holies, had long reminded the people that while God was among them, he was not yet fully accessible. Only once a year, and only by the high priest with blood in hand, could one man enter that sacred space, and even then, with fear and trembling. But in that moment, as Jesus spoke those words of finality, the symbolic wall was torn open, declaring to all the world that the separation caused by sin had been bridged, that the intimacy lost in Eden had now been restored, and that the way into the presence of God was no longer guarded by curtains or rituals, but was made open through the torn body of the Son. This was not merely the end of a religious system, it was the beginning of direct access to divine communion. What had once been limited to a few was now extended to all who would come through Christ, for his flesh had become the new and living way, his blood the new covenant, and his cross the new altar where mercy triumphed over judgment. In that sacred hour, the temple veil, once a symbol of exclusion, became a banner of welcome. Heaven's courtroom was opened, and the King himself now invited all to enter boldly, not because they were worthy, but because the price had been paid and the door forever opened. When Jesus cried out, "It is finished," he was not simply stating the end of a journey or the close of a chapter in redemptive history. He was issuing a royal proclamation, one that shattered spiritual shackles and announced freedom to a world long held captive by fear, guilt, and the unrelenting power of sin. This was not the whisper of a broken man giving up his spirit, but the decree of a king who had just overthrown the dominion of darkness, a declaration that the prison doors of the human soul had been burst open, not by effort or merit, but by blood and mercy. For centuries, humanity had been enslaved not only by external oppression, but by internal corruption, by the unseen chains of shame, regret, and the impossible weight of trying to earn divine approval through flawed obedience. The law, holy and just, had exposed sin, but offered no power to conquer it. The rituals, though sacred, could never cleanse the conscience. And so generation after generation lived under a yoke that grew heavier with time, with hearts longing for a freedom they could neither define nor attain. In that single phrase, "It is finished," Jesus declared that the curse was broken, that the power of sin to control, accuse, and condemn had been crushed, and that those who believed in his name would no longer live under the tyranny of guilt or the shadow of separation. This was not freedom in theory, nor a vague spiritual idea, but a real and lasting liberation sealed in suffering and announced in victory. Paul would later write that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, and that those who belong to Christ are no longer slaves but sons and daughters, free to approach, free to worship, free to live. The freedom Jesus declared on the cross was not the temporary kind offered by political leaders or fleeting movements. It was the eternal kind that transforms identity, reclaims dignity, and sets the soul ablaze with peace. The chains that held the human heart were not simply loosened, they were broken forever. And in the quiet hearts of all who listen, that cry still echoes, "You are free." To the casual observer standing at the foot of the cross, bruised by grief or numbed by indifference, the words "It is finished" might have seemed like the final breath of a man crushed under the weight of failure, another tragic ending in a world filled with injustice and broken dreams. But heaven and hell knew otherwise, because those words were not spoken from a place of defeat, but from the summit of divine victory, a triumph secured not by avoiding suffering, but by enduring it to the very end and transforming it into a pathway to eternal glory. This cry was the roar of the Lion of Judah disguised in the groan of the crucified Lamb, a war cry that pierced through the veil of time and reverberated across the heavens, declaring to every power, principality, and spiritual authority that the reign of death had ended, that the grip of sin had been broken, and that the long-awaited moment of redemption had arrived with final, irreversible force. Enemy who had schemed and struck since Eden, believing the cross to be his ultimate weapon, now stood in stunned silence, for what he thought would crush the Son of God had only confirmed his own defeat. The scriptures had long hinted at a victory unlike any other, a seed that would crush the serpent, a servant who would be exalted after his suffering, a king who would reign from a throne not made of gold, but of wood and nails. And now, in this moment, all of that was realized. The cross, which Rome intended as a tool of shame, became a scepter of divine power. The hill called Golgotha, a place of execution, transformed into the battlefield of salvation. Jesus did not whisper those words in resignation. He announced them with authority, not because he was losing his life, but because he was giving it willingly, sovereignly, and victoriously. And the power of that cry still shakes the foundations of fear, silences the lies of shame, and proclaims to all who suffer and struggle that victory has already been won. The tomb was still sealed, the resurrection not yet seen. And yet, even before the stone rolled away, Jesus had already declared the outcome: "It is finished." Long after the Roman soldiers had returned to their barracks and the voices of the crowd had faded into silence, the words spoken on that cross continued to echo, not as relics of a distant tragedy, but as the heartbeat of a revolution built not on violence or power, but on the most radical force the world has ever known, love. For in declaring it is finished, Jesus was not only completing a mission or fulfilling prophecy. He was giving birth to a movement, one rooted in grace, sustained by mercy, and carried forward by hearts transformed by the reality of a love that lays itself down for others. This legacy cannot be measured by institutions or titles, but by the quiet lives of those who, across centuries and continents, heard those words and were never the same. Men and women who found in them forgiveness, hope, and a reason to live not for self but for others. The cry of the cross became a call to compassion, a summons to serve, and an anthem of reconciliation, not merely between God and man, but between neighbor and stranger, enemy and friend. From the deserts of early monastics to the hidden chambers of persecuted believers, from the writings of saints to the whispered prayers of children, the impact of those words reshaped human history, not through conquest, but through hearts that had been set ablaze by the love that bore all things, believed all things, and endured all things. The message of the cross became more than a theological point. It became the foundation upon which countless acts of courage, sacrifice, and selfless devotion were built. Jesus did not just finish a task, he ignited a fire. And that fire continues to burn in every act of forgiveness, every gesture of kindness, every life laid down for another, as the echo of it is finished carries forward, not as a conclusion, but as the enduring song of a love that has no end. If those words spoken from the cross were meant only for that moment, then their power would have faded with the dust of Calvary. But they were not confined to history. The declaration "it is finished" reaches across time, not as a phrase to be remembered, but as a reality to be lived. For those who believe, the completed work of Christ is not merely a theological truth. It is the foundation of daily life, a lens through which to view suffering, struggle, and purpose. To live in the finished work means to walk not in fear, but in faith. To rise each day, not as a prisoner of past failures, but as one whose debt has been paid, whose chains have been broken, and whose future is secured. It means refusing to carry what Christ has already borne, and learning to rest in what he has already accomplished. This is not a call to passivity, but to freedom, a freedom that moves, that serves, that loves without fear of rejection, and forgives without conditions. When guilt whispers lies, when shame attempts to speak louder than grace, when the weight of this world presses down, the finished work stands as a fortress. It is finished means the battle for identity is over, the striving for worth is done, and the presence of God is not something to chase, but a gift already given. From the heart of this truth flows peace, not peace that denies trouble, but peace that endures through it, rooted in the unshakable foundation of what Christ has already secured. This reality shapes marriages, transforms relationships, strengthens the weak, humbles the proud, and brings rest to the weary. It calls believers to live boldly, to serve joyfully, and to hope relentlessly, knowing that everything that needed to be done has already been done. The door is open. The way is made. The work is finished. And now the invitation remains for each person in every season to stop striving, to start trusting, and to live every moment in the power of those eternal words. It is finished. If this message moved you, if these truths gave you something to reflect on or encouraged your faith, take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe to stay connected with more videos like this. Click the like button to help others find it. And share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. We read everyone. Most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone close to you. Someone who might be searching. Let these words reach further. Let the story continue.